Hello and welcome to our Creationtide series, week 3. We are on week 3, and this week our theme is protecting the commons. Today I have the very lovely Eileen Davis, Archdeacon of Cardigan, with us. We have Father Neil Hook from Haverfordwest. Give us a wave. Excellent.
Like celebrity squares.
And Reverend Neil from Langham. No, not Reverend. That's wrong. Start that one again. You see, Reverend Marcus from Langham. Oh dear. Our Bible passage for today is Psalm 114. When Israel went out from Egypt, the house of Jacob, from a people of strange language, Judah became his sanctuary, Israel his dominion. The sea looked and fled. Jordan turned back. The mountains skipped like rams, the hills like lambs. What ails you, O sea, that you flee? O Jordan, that you turn back? O mountains, that you skip like rams, O hills like lambs. Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turns the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a spring of water. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks
be to God.
So, questions for you today. My first question is, what do we mean by protecting the commons?
I think you've got to say what is the commons first before you can talk about protecting it.
Yeah.
And the commons are our shared cultural and natural resources, all the things that are accessible to everybody in society, all of the shared spaces, not just the common land in terms of being on. I used to minister up in the Brecon Beacons, and a lot of that was commons land, but also within our own societies, within our own parishes, those village greens, those verges, those shared areas that aren't owned by individuals, that aren't private gardens or private properties. But more than that, it's our air and our water. In fact, it's the habitable earth, really. That's what the commons is. So when we talk about protecting the commons, that's what we're talking about. And somebody else can talk about the protection bit now.
Well, with regards to the common, and if we do actually protect the common land, which is there in and around for all of us to enjoy and also to value, we need to, through protecting the actual common land itself, it gives us an opportunity to come back to the point that you, Neil, made with regards to the air, the beauty of all the creation around us, because I'm surrounded by Llanllwni Mountain and Llanfihangel Rhosacorn Mountain, which encompasses in and around 1,000 acres. And it is the most beautiful scene when you actually just look at it, value it, the sheep that graze upon it. And even as a farmer in this vicinity, I'm allowed to take 2 cows and 6 sheep up on my little stead upon that part of the common land. But it also embraces wildlife at its best. It also embraces different flowers and fauna. And also it gives us an opportunity, when we are literally on top of the mountain, to appreciate everything that we can see from there.
Thank you.
I think it's... Go on, Marcus, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, yeah. So I get my microphone up here. I'll just go down to it. There are. I'm thinking it's a rather beautiful phrase that Pope Francis employed recently in his Laudato Si encyclical. And it just sort of gets this idea of the commons across, because it can sound a little bit dry and arid. And he just talks about the earth as our common home. And suddenly it just brings it home, doesn't it? Of course, we live here, we share it. And the whole thing is in common, even though we own little bits of it, in our sort of property laws and so on. The whole thing is our common home and an inheritance. And so it's just important to have that in mind, especially as Christians, you know, when we recognize the world as a gift to us, and you know, we're just sort of trustees of it. But of course, it's as Neil says, it's wider than just land, isn't it? We're very, very aware nowadays of the sort of environmental situation that we're in, that the commons that we need to protect, you know, is atmosphere and its ocean and its rivers and so on. It's where it's all those sort of shared things, and it's even wider than that. It's like ecosystems and the things that they produce for us, and you know, forests and so on. It's just all that common stuff that gets pushed to the side when we start saying this bit's mine, I'm going to do this here, and forget what consequences there are for other people and the global commons. It's trying to bring that back into our thinking, that we share this planet together. It's all our sort of common home.
And a lot of the common, actually, if I bring it back to the land again, a lot of the common land itself, because of the manner and way that it is just naturally left for all of us to enjoy and embrace, and it is grazed accordingly, a lot of this land will actually absorb the carbon monoxide that's within the air, because it has that natural ability to do so. And also maybe bringing it back again to the beauty of the creation, how much we've valued having such wide open spaces throughout being in lockdown, and the opportunity that people could have walked 1,000 acres, you know, in my little small village, we'd be, you know, I wouldn't see anybody, just a few birds and a few sheep. And we need to truly thank God for where we live and what he gives to us of the common good.
But even in Haverfordwest, where I'm based, if you haven't got access to the common land, you can walk around the town, you can walk around the city centre, and those roads, those pavements, they're not private. They're managed by the town council, by Pembrokeshire County Council. They're held in trust, as it were, for the common community. And I'm so glad that, you know, Archdeacon Eileen doesn't have to cope perhaps with the blatant disregard that people seem to show our commons. You wouldn't treat your own home just by throwing rubbish on the ground, and yet people go outside, and there's vandalism and there's littering and all sorts of things. The difference between public and private, we don't seem to have a stake. People seem to take the public areas for granted, like they don't have a responsibility to them. And one of the things that has started in the last 15 years is the guerrilla gardening movement, which I'm sure you're aware of, where they take these small patches of abandoned waste ground in the centre of towns and cities that have been completely ignored by anybody, and they turn them into something for the public benefit. And I think that's something that churches can actually get behind as well. I mean, we talked about eco-church, which extends not just to the church building, but the churchyard itself. And we've name-checked in the last couple of episodes God's Acre, which helps congregations to actually look at the way that their churchyards can be used. Well, I've got a city centre church. The churchyard is very small, but there is a path that goes through it. So, you know, we're going to be looking at trying to find a way to green people's lives in the very small space that we've got in St Mary's, Haverfordwest.
Thank you, Neil. Psalm 114 leads us on a journey in only 8 verses, from the relationship between God and Israel to the relationship between God and the whole earth. Why was land such an important thing for the Israelites, and what does that have to do with our relationship to land and to God?
Well, yeah, land was important, wasn't it, to the Israelites? And I guess it dates back perhaps to that close relationship between the land and the promises of God that were made to Abraham. the promises made to him were that he'd have many descendants, but also that he'd have a land and somewhere to dwell. And I suppose, the Israelites, the people of God, were formed by being released from captivity in someone else's land and promised their own. So this sense of liberation, but also being led to the sort of a place where they can be themselves. So they had that really close within them. But I think, we can discuss this, but I think sometimes they got a little bit carried away with that and sort of overemphasized the ownership of the land, rather than the fact that God was giving them a tract of land as a gift to be managed, and the land was his. And we get carried away by the same sort of possessiveness, really, and think that this is our country, it's our land, and so on. And the Israelites were no exception. But that wasn't really, I don't think God's intention, because even before that Abrahamic covenant, which is so important, there's the earlier one that you get in Noah, in the book of Noah, in the book of Genesis, given to Noah and his family, when God makes the covenant with them and all of creation, and never again will I wipe out the earth. This is my promise. That the rainbow is the symbol of that. And so, right at the heart of the faith, really, is this sense that God has a promise with the land and people together, and somehow it's that togetherness of both that are important.
People in place, having a sense of place, I think, is quite important for people. And we know that the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness. We know that Mary and Joseph were refugees that fled, and yet we are employing millions of pounds to bolster our sea defences, to stop people who are fleeing oppression or are seeking a new life coming across the channel into our land, because it's ours. That's the rhetoric that's coming. It's not theirs, it's ours, as in it belongs to us. Well, no, it's ours, it's shared, and we have a shared responsibility. And I think particularly in the UK, because we don't share land borders with anybody, we can be quite jingoistic and quite particular about who we let in. And the political rhetoric that has been ramping up over the last 10 or 15 years is quite damaging. And as a church, we have a responsibility to speak out, because we have an element of culpability as well. That you look at those maps when the British Empire was at its height, and half the world was covered in one particular colour. And yes, we've withdrawn, but we still see ourselves as a global power player. We still want to get involved in foreign conflicts, but we seek to obviate the responsibilities that comes with that, in the same way that I am absolutely convinced, and Brother Sam talked about this, the Franciscan who talked to the clergy of the diocese recently, that there's going to start to be a shift from those migrants who are escaping conflict to those migrants who are going to be escaping climate change and looking for a new life. And we have lived in the UK a very comfortable life with lots of modern facilities that has contributed massively to climate change. And I'm just concerned that we will take exactly the same attitude to climate change migrants as we do to those migrants who are forced to flee because of conflict.
Yeah, probably. I mean, wading into some difficult political waters, but which we have to do, really. I agree with you. And at the heart of that is this sense of land, isn't it? And perhaps an over sense of entitlement that we sometimes have. I mean, it's neighbourly if you go to someone else's house to sort of, to try and fit in and live by their rules. I think that's fine if people come here to expect them to to sort of want to fit in and see how we do things as well. But to sort of shut the door is a very different sort of way of being, saying, sorry, you can't even come in. That's entirely different, isn't it?
Bringing it back to, Marcus, what you were saying with regards to entitlement, is it Zimbabwe now that are looking at means and ways of giving back the land that was taken over by our black brothers and sisters from white natives that used to be there farming the land, and they're now going to start to give that land back? And there's going to be huge issues undoubtedly there. But but as a farmer myself, knowing that inheriting land is something that is extremely important for somebody that like myself, knowing that Owain, my son, is now the 6th generation on our farm, and inheriting the land can actually be great and wonderful, especially for young people who want to have their foot on the ladder to be owning their own farms. But also, if you are inheriting a farm, it can put a lot of pressure on you as well, as the generation that has to ensure that everything keeps on going, and not to be the weakest link in this long chain of people that have been farming that land throughout all the generations. And I well remember this when Owain was told by his grandfather, my father-in-law, and he said, "You do realise now that it is only you that can take over the inheritance of this farm." And I told Owain, "Well, you've got to carve whatever furrow you want for yourself." And this is a position that many young farmers find themselves in. And he said, "Don't worry, Tatki, I will be the 6th generation on the farm," because he wants to do it.
Yeah.
You need to ensure that those who do want to actually have the opportunity of living the wonderful parable that is said in Welsh, "Torri coes fel coes fan had," to be able to cut the furrow as the furrow that was there, cut by my father before me, that they have that opportunity to do so. But not everybody does want to. And as a church, we've got a responsibility of caring for all within our agricultural industry. And I would say that, and especially through Tir Dewi, we're trying to do that with a young person now taking on board the post of being the Young Farmers Project Worker for Tir Dewi.
Well, Archdeacon Eileen, both you and I were in ministry a while ago now, but we've known each other for quite a long time. We used to meet up every year at the Royal Welsh Show, and we can remember that year when the show was cancelled because of foot and mouth. And both of us were in agricultural ministry, and in my own parish in Mid Wales, we had farms that lost herds that had been built up over generations. I can remember going to visit, using the proper biosecurity, a member of my congregation who had just lost his herd, and him feeling that he'd almost betrayed all the generations before him, his father, his grandfather, his grandfather's father, because there is that sense of rootedness, there is that sense of place. And that's what you get in Psalm 114. It's that rootedness, but not to go too deep into the actual psalm itself, but notice the tense change. Notice the fact that at the beginning it talks about the past, and by the end it's talking about the now. And this is what Scripture is all about. It's building on that heritage. It's building on that tradition, the Anglican tradition of Scripture, of reason, of tradition, of history, and using that and bringing it to contemporary society. If Tir Dewi had been around when Archdeacon and Eileen and I were struggling in the early 2000s with the fallout from foot and mouth, then I'm sure, we could have done much more than we actually did.
Yes,
And we were facing even today the many farmers that won't stand by that are losing their livestock through TB, etc. You know, we truly realise the need of being there, and the word Psalm 114 really does remind us of what the past was and the relevance of the words of today, what this psalm means to all of us today, those who do inherit the land.
And drawing on church history, I want to recommend a resource, which is a little bit out there, but, you know, the Billy Bragg song, The World Turned Upside Down, which I saw him perform at Greenbelt, which is all about the diggers who took over common land in 1649 as Christians because the landlords wanted to fence it in. And they called the land a common treasury for all. And I have met many farmers who the land belongs to them and it is passed down from generation to generation, but they they still see themselves as stewards of that land for everybody. And the church has been fighting this fight of seeing the land as a common treasury for all, going back to scripture, but all the way through the history of the Anglican Church as well. And it is quite oppositional and it can get quite political. I mean, this Sunday's gospel reading, if that's not political, then I don't know what is. The king who had servants who were in debt. Society is saying to the politicians, you've got to make right on what's happened to our society. You've got to, you know, you've got to take responsibility on our behalf for the environment. And it seems as if the politicians are just turning to those who are vulnerable and pointing the finger at them or exploiting them so that they can appear green and eco-friendly.
Probably, Neil. Yeah, I mean, I don't have much huge confidence in our sort of current administration's green credentials, unless they think there's votes in it. But maybe that's me just being a little bit, cynical. But interesting, talking about the land and entitlement and ownership and so on, and the fact that it is an interesting area to explore. And I guess I'm not trying to say that Christianity proclaims that property is theft in some sort of slogan, you know, that everything should be held in common. I think the property laws that we've got, you know, they're fine if they're there to protect the vulnerable from exploitation by the powerful, aren't they? That's how I see it. But when they're used by the powerful to keep the vulnerable out, then that's when they're being abused, isn't it? So it's not so much the ownership is bad, it's what you do with it. And as Eileen sort of hints, you know, when someone has that privilege of inheriting some land, huge responsibility, not everyone want to take that upon themselves, but when someone does, you know, thank God for that they then become custodians for everybody, you know, for their family,